Okay, this is my summary slide for the year 1962. It's a crucial year in JFK's presidency and an alarming year. And so we're going to read through this together. It's very important. In 1962, JFK's conflict with his military leadership escalated to alarming levels. And the US and USSR flirted with nuclear apocalypse during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, JCS Chairman Lyman Lemnitzer, working together with the operations officer for the Mongoose Project, Major General Edward G. Lansdale, proposed a series of disturbing pretexts for war with Cuba that were designed to be the public justification for an overwhelming US military invasion to overthrow Castro and institute regime change in Cuba. Mongoose, which was initiated on November 30th, 1961, was the Kennedy Brothers program to promote economic warfare, sabotage, and propaganda actions against Cuba in an attempt to stimulate regime change. The only thing ruled out was a US invasion. Behind JFK's back, Lemnitzer got Lansdale to request that the Joint Staff develop a policy statement on Cuba and pretexts for a US invasion. They worked together on this project from mid-January through mid-March 1962. On paper, it looked like the whole thing originated with Lansdale, but it was a joint effort, wholly supported and probably initiated by Lemnitzer himself. Lemnitzer and the chiefs heartily endorsed the many proposed pretexts for invasion of Cuba and forwarded them to Secretary of Defense McNamara on March 13th, 1962. The name of the file was Operation Northwoods. As John Newman has written, quote, "From the very beginning, Lemnitzer had been using Kennedy's point man, General Lansdale, to turn Operation Mongoose into Operation Northwoods. Lansdale had become a stalking horse for Lemnitzer," end quote. Now, JFK unequivocally rejected the idea of pretexts for war and also rejected once again the concept of a US invasion of Cuba in a seminal March 16, 1962 meeting with Lemnitzer, Lansdale, and others. On April 10th, 1962, in an act of unparalleled insubordination, Lemnitzer and the Joint Chiefs recommended to the Secretary of Defense that the United States invade Cuba anyway, without using pretexts to justify the action, and did so in extremely strong language that was apocalyptic in nature, in what amounted to a scolding leveled at SECDEF and the president, which adopted the tone of an ultimatum. Now, Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles, MRBMs, were discovered in Cuba during a U-2 surveillance flight on October 14th, 1962. And the ensuing Cuban Missile Crisis from October 16th through the 28th brought the United States and the Soviet Union to the brink of nuclear war. Although JFK resolved the crisis through diplomacy, he clashed seriously with the chiefs, who insisted that the United States launch massive airstrikes against Cuba and follow with a full-scale invasion. The consensus of the Joint Chiefs afterward was that JFK had failed in his duty, and they accused him to his face of what amounted to weakness and cowardice, of losing. Now, here are the two collaborators on the Northwoods scheme. The Northwoods scheme to use pretexts to justify a US invasion of Cuba. Lemnitzer had been chairman of the Joint Chiefs since 1960. Ed Lansdale, his favorite sandbox was Vietnam. Kennedy had originally promised him the ambassadorship and had withdrawn that offer once Dean Rusk made it known that he would resign if Kennedy did that. Lansdale was a CIA operative in uniform. Dulles was his sponsor during the 1950s, so Rusk wouldn't have that. So Lansdale then began to advocate for combat troops in Vietnam. And when that was shot down with NSAM 111 on November 22nd, 61, Kennedy gave him a new sandbox to play in, which was Cuba. And he was appointed operations officer for the Cuba group. Every time the Cuba group met, it was a meeting of the special group augmented of the National Security Council. And Lansdale was the driving force of the specific plans and operations that were being proposed. Now, the Northwoods file was discovered and declassified by the ARRB, the organization for which I worked for 3 years. I'm proud to have been part of the discovery and the declassification of this seminal package of documents. On January 17th, 1962, Lansdale requested a policy statement on Cuba from the Joint Staff Planners in the Pentagon. General Craig, Lemnitzer's chief of covert action on the Joint Staff and the author of the Pretexts for War in the Northwoods papers, responded on February 2nd, 62, with the policy statement that Lansdale had requested. The Soviets could establish land, sea, or air bases in Cuba. More ominously, the Soviets could provide Castro with a number of ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads, or they could furnish the missiles and maintain joint control of the nuclear warheads. Now, the Joint Staff above was either unusually prescient or it had advanced knowledge of what the Soviets were considering doing, which the current historical record concludes was not formally considered by the Soviet government at Khrushchev's request until May of 1962, and not finally approved until June 10th. But as I say, if you read the part in red above, this suggests that they had early knowledge of this. And Dr. John Newman is looking into this, and he'll be discussing what some of these indicators are in volume 4 of his book. The policy statement continued, the Department of Defense holds that the communist regime in Cuba is incompatible with the minimum security requirements of the Western Hemisphere. Now, on February 5th, 1962, Lansdale requested in writing that the Joint Staff prepare pretexts for the invasion of Cuba. This tasking put into motion the invasion plan that Lemnitzer and Lansdale had cooked up together. On March 9th, 1962, more than a month later, the Joint Staff, under General Craig, sent the whole kit and caboodle a long shopping list of imaginative pretexts for war designed to justify a U.S. invasion of Cuba to the Joint Chiefs of Staff for consideration. The list had been over 1 month in the making. On March 13th, 62, and this is the key date, the Joint Chiefs of Staff sent the entire package by cover letter signed personally by General Lyman Lemnitzer to the Secretary of Defense. It was a top secret, special handling, no foreign memorandum titled Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. The code name for the entire operation was Northwoods. Now, here are the specific pretexts for war that you'll find in the Northwoods papers. These are shocking and appalling. I've paraphrased all of them except one, which I quoted verbatim. First, fake a Cuban attack on the U.S. base at Guantanamo Bay and blame it on Castro's forces. This would have used friendly Cubans, probably people who had already emigrated to the U.S. in Cuban uniforms, pretending that they were attacking the base and then being captured and interrogated and photographed to produce the fake evidence. The next one, a fake Remember the Maine incident could be engineered, in which a U.S. ship could be blown up and sunk in Guantanamo Bay and blamed on Castro. Now remember, the battleship Maine blew up from some mysterious explosion in 1898 in Havana Harbor. And the yellow press and the right-wingers in the United States blamed it on a bomb planted on the ship's hull by the Cuban government. But that was never proven. And in fact, later, Hyman Rickover, Navy Admiral, did a study, and he thought that the ship self-exploded for reasons of its own, that there was a fire in the coal bunker. And the coal bunker, coal was the fuel, was right next to the ammunition magazine. So he thinks that none of the Cubans did this to the Maine. That's what he thought when he wrote his study. But they wanted to blow up and sink a ship in Guantanamo Bay with great publicity and blame it on Castro, which would become a casus belli for another war in Cuba, just like the Maine was when the Maine blew up in 1898. That started the Spanish-American War. Here I'll quote verbatim. We could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, or even in Washington. The terror campaign could be pointed at the Cuban refugees seeking haven in the United States. We could sink a boatload of Cubans en route to Florida, real or simulated. We could foster attempts on the lives of Cuban refugees in the United States, even to the extent of wounding, in instances to be widely publicized, end quote. In addition, quote, a few plastic bombs, end quote, could be exploded, quote, in carefully chosen spots, the arrest of Cuban agents and the release of prepared documents substantiating Cuban involvement would also be helpful in projecting the idea of an irresponsible government, end quote. That's rather heartless. A U.S. fighter jet, like an F-86, could be painted to look like a Russian MiG and could simulate an attack on a real U.S. airliner filled with passengers. Now, how stupid is this? Any one photograph of the so-called MiG conducting its so-called attack on the airliner, if developed and released publicly by one of the passengers, would have revealed that it was not really a Russian MiG. It would have been revealed as an F-86. And the whole scheme would have blown up in their faces. The next one's even more outlandish and more James Bondish. A real commercial airliner turned into a drone without passengers on board could be flown on autopilot after leaving its secret base in Florida, Eglin Field, and could be blown up by a bomb over Cuba after playing a tape-recorded broadcast from on board the airplane, during which the so-called pilots were heard describing a so-called attack by Cuban MiG fighters. Well, they could destroy an airplane in the middle of the air, and they could have a tape recording of the so-called broadcast, but there wouldn't have been any bodies in the wreckage. So I don't think this idea was very smart either. It wouldn't ultimately have fooled anybody. A 2 or 3 day inspection of the crash site would have revealed no bodies, and it would have been revealed as an elaborate hoax by the United States. And finally, a submarine could deposit at sea parts from a destroyed U.S. fighter plane, which had been supposedly shot down by Cuban MiG fighter planes. This hoax would be supported by actual aircraft flying at low altitude and transmitting false radio messages simulating an attack prior to the submarine depositing the debris at sea. So this is what you'll find in the Northwoods papers. Going down to the middle of this slide, John Newman wrote, quote, the founding fathers of the American Republic would have been outraged. They probably turned over in their graves at the moral depravity of General Lemnitzer and those chiefs who agreed with his Northwoods recommendations, end quote. He then added, speaking as a former Army officer, quote, General Lemnitzer betrayed his country and his oath of office to protect and defend its Constitution, end quote. Here's my own assessment. The Allies convicted and executed Nazi generals and former Nazi government officials at Nuremberg following World War II for, quote, conspiracy to commit aggressive war, end quote. The Northwoods scheme was nothing less. It was conspiracy to commit aggressive war. Now, JFK rejected Northwoods. We don't have a written response from Robert McNamara to the chief's memo of March 13th, but we do have the minutes of a meeting held on March 16th. And the minutes of that meeting were written by Ed Lansdale himself, and they were not declassified until March 2005. David Talbot wrote about this in his book, Brothers. So 3 days after Lemnitzer signed and submitted his Northwoods memo to McNamara, JFK rejected the concept of pretexts justifying a U.S. invasion of Cuba. Present at the meeting were Maxwell Taylor, Lyman Lemnitzer, Ed Lansdale, McGeorge Bundy, and CIA Director McComb. And Lansdale, held forth during the meeting, quote, "We must be ready to intervene with U.S. forces if necessary," end quote. JFK responded immediately by asking negatively that the group wasn't proposing that he authorize military intervention, was it? No, Taylor rushed to reassure him. But Lemnitzer couldn't restrain himself, Talbot wrote, and ran Northwoods up the flagpole by saying that the Joint Chiefs, quote, had plans for creating plausible pretexts to use force against Cuba, with the pretext either attacks on U.S. aircraft or a Cuban action in Latin America for which we would retaliate, end quote. Talbot writes that Kennedy was not amused, fixed Lemnitzer with a hard look, and, quote, said bluntly that we were not discussing the use of military force, end quote, according to Lansdale's minutes. And that the president made the point that Lemnitzer might not have enough divisions to fight in Cuba if the Soviets responded by going to war over Berlin or elsewhere. So the Joint Chiefs of Staff pushed back 25 days later on April 10th, 1962, with perhaps the most insubordinate proposal that they ever sent to JFK. This is what John Newman calls the stink bomb memo. And that's exactly what it was. In a scolding, insistent memo to Secretary of Defense McNamara, titled Cuba, the JCS insisted on invading Cuba anyway, without offering any pretexts this time. Here are some key excerpts. The Joint Chiefs of Staff believe the Cuba problem must be solved in the near future. Furthermore, they see no prospect of early success in overthrowing the present communist regime, either as a result of internal uprisings or external political, economic, or psychological pressures. In other words, they're saying Mongoose is worthless, and it was worthless. They go on. Accordingly, they believe that military intervention by the United States will be required to overthrow the present communist regime. They continue. The United States cannot tolerate permanent existence of a communist government in the Western Hemisphere. They go on. Time favors the Cuban regime in the communist bloc. They continue. The Joint Chiefs of Staff believe that the United States can undertake military intervention in Cuba without risk of general war. Forces available would assure rapid essential military control of Cuba. Continued police action would be required. So they're acknowledging there might be a guerrilla war afterwards, or local resistance that would continue. They're also saying, we're confident we can do this without a nuclear war breaking out elsewhere. Okay. And finally, they conclude, the Joint Chiefs of Staff recommend that a national policy of early military intervention be adopted by the United States. They also recommend that such intervention be undertaken as soon as possible, and preferably before the release of National Guard and Reserve forces presently on active duty, end quote. Wow. There's no ambiguity or doubt about this memo. This stink bomb, similar to others written about Laos and Vietnam policy, has about it the flavor and tone of an ultimatum. Once Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles, MRBMs, were discovered in Cuba in mid-October of '62, this surely became their "we told you so" document and provided them with what they considered the moral high ground with JFK when they insisted that he bomb and invade Cuba during the missile crisis. Now, as I indicated earlier, John Newman is conducting research into the strong possibility that people within the United States at a very high level knew the Soviets were considering putting nuclear missiles in Cuba as early as February of 1962. Even though Khrushchev's meetings with the Presidium, his first two meetings at this high official level, where he asked people to say yes or no, didn't occur until May 21st and May 24th. He believes this was being considered by members of the Soviet government much earlier, and that our eavesdropping capabilities and perhaps even human intelligence revealed that to us. And if this turns out to be true, then this stink bomb memo, and Northwoods for that matter, but this memo here, the stink bomb, becomes even more ominous, because it would appear to be and I told you so, that they could pull out of their pocket later and use to pressure the president when they had him in a corner over bombing and invading Cuba later when the missiles really were discovered. So you'll be reading more about this in volume 4, called Apocalypse by John Newman. It's a hypothesis worth considering. Okay, so let's talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis in some depth. John Newman didn't do that in his presentation, so I want to do that. It's a favorite subject of mine. John hasn't quite gotten there in his current research yet. He'll be writing about it later in volume 4. So he didn't cover it in his slide presentation. So I am covering it. My entire presentation today is intended to complement his and to cover in some depth areas that he didn't go into in his presentation. So I think our two presentations do complement each other. So the Cuban Missile Crisis officially was October 16th through 28th, 1962. The USSR placed medium-range ballistic missiles, henceforth called MRBMs, with nuclear warheads in Cuba. Now, this is a photograph of one of the 36 MRBMs that they placed in Cuba. They called it the R-12 missile. I'm going to use their name for the missile, not the NATO name. They called it the R-12. It was a liquid fuel missile. This is one on display in Moscow at a parade. This image is provided by and information about it provided by our source, known as Ironbark, Colonel Penkovsky, who was our mole inside the Soviet leadership. Now, John McCone was aware, and the CIA was aware of increased Soviet shipping into Cuba in July and August, and increased Soviet arms shipments into Cuba in July and August, not only from surveilling the numbers of ships going into the island with aerial surveillance at sea, but from human intelligence reports. So he predicted in mid-August, that the Soviets were going to put nuclear missiles in Cuba. And Kennedy listened politely, didn't respond. Most people thought they wouldn't do that because they had never done that before. The Soviets had never before put nuclear missiles in other countries. But he predicted it. And then on August 29th, when this photo and other similar photos were taken, it provided indirect confirmation of McCone's prediction in this way. High-altitude U-2 surveillance photos taken that day showed 8 surface-to-air anti-aircraft missile sites under construction in Cuba. And so his whole point afterwards was they wouldn't be putting expensive, powerful anti-aircraft missiles, the best in the world, they wouldn't be putting those into Cuba unless it was to protect something very important. And he was right. So the SA-2 anti-aircraft batteries were being installed to protect the MRBMs, which were on the way. And in fact, the first medium-range ballistic missiles were offloaded on September 9th, and others were offloaded later in September and early in October. Now, what NATO called the SA-2 guideline missile, this anti-aircraft missile, the Soviets called the S-75 Dvina. So here's the photograph of a completed SA-2 missile site with the so-called Star of David configuration, and then you can see the 6 sites inside the circle for the mobile launchers. And it's easy to identify from the air, distinct configuration. And this is a photo someone took at an Eastern Europe outdoor museum of an SA-2 missile. Here's a close-up of the SA-2 missile. It was the world's best anti-aircraft missile and had previously shot down the U-2 aircraft flown by CIA pilot Francis Gary Powers over Russia on May 1st, 1960. And the USSR eventually installed 144 of their S-75 missiles in Cuba at 24 different sites all around the island. So this was the telegraphing of their hand. This is the early indication that they were about to do something very serious in Cuba, and they wanted to defend something very important with this powerful system. This is the U-2 aircraft, the famous spy plane developed by designer Kelly Johnson of Blockade, working for Richard Bissell of the CIA in the 1950s at Groom Lake in Nevada. So note here that 2 days before this flight was made, the US Air Force took over U-2 flights from the CIA. And then once they took them over, the airplanes were no longer painted black, I don't believe. I believe they were then, they reverted to the silver metal paint scheme with vivid US Air Force markings. But this is a U-2 aircraft, a fragile high altitude photo reconnaissance plane with the world's best camera and best film inside of it. And several more were flown after this first flight. I think something like approximately 9 more flights were made during the month of October after this first one. This is the first and perhaps most famous photograph shown to President Kennedy on October 16th. They were developed by the CIA's National Photographic Interpretation Center, NPIC, abbreviated NPIC. That's where Dino Brugione and Arthur Lundell worked. So they made briefing boards every day and presented them to President Kennedy. And the operating altitudes of the U-2 were above 70,000 feet, sometimes 75,000 feet, maybe higher. So here's another photograph taken on the 14th. And the photo interpreters could tell what they were looking at. Missile trailers, erectors, tents, missile tents, and launching systems. Here's one developed on Monday the 15th before they briefed Kennedy. So additional U-2 missions, as I say, were quickly flown over Cuba after Kennedy was briefed on the 16th. Many of them were flown starting the next day. And the next day, in one of the flights, U-2 flights, we discovered a launch site for a bigger type of missile, intermediate range ballistic missiles, an IRBM. Now, the IRBM missiles never made it to Cuba because after Kennedy made a speech on October 22nd on national TV announcing missiles in Cuba, all the ships carrying the IRBMs, the bigger missiles, turned around the next day at sea. They turned around and went home. and so did the other ships carrying supporting equipment for the IRBMs. But the IRBMs, you see, required permanent launch sites. They were not mobile missiles. The MRBMs were mobile. They had a mobile launcher that could be moved around. And the IRBMs had to be permanently fixed, and it was going to take up to 4 months to build their launch site. So this stuck out like a sore thumb, and we knew what this was. Later, low-level photography during the crisis, taken by many different aircraft, including reconnaissance versions of the F-8 Crusader, revealed much easier to understand photographs, much more provocative and useful in convincing other people. So here's one of the low altitude photographs, low altitude, high resolution, taken later. And here's another one. Oxidizer tanks, fuel tank trailers, missile shelter tents, missile erectors, cables. Each site, although mobile, it had a cement launch base, which the rocket had to sit on once it was erected. Now, why did the USSR send nuclear missiles to Cuba? Ultimately, it's the reaction to their perceived and factual inferiority, their nuclear inferiority, especially as revealed by the Roswell-Gilpatrick speech on October 21st, which I mentioned earlier. This heightened to new levels their existing insecurity and paranoia about nuclear inferiority to the United States in terms of long-range weapons and the systems to deliver the long-range weapons. The Soviets had a lot of medium-range and intermediate-range missiles that they could have easily destroyed Europe with. They had very few long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles, and the ones they had were not reliable yet, or took too long to prepare for launch. So as soon as Gilpatrick made that speech, these guys began to worry about ways to compensate for that massive inferiority. They were afraid the US would be tempted to use our superiority over them and attack them. They were afraid of a US first strike. Now, Khrushchev was informed by his defense counsel at Pitsunda in early April of '62 that the USSR could neither successfully defend the homeland from a US first strike, nor would it be able to respond militarily afterwards. There wouldn't be anything left to respond with. So I've got a documentary where it says that he was informed of this by his defense counsel in April. The narrator says April. Another book was just published which says he was informed by the defense counsel of these unpleasant facts in February '62, which is really interesting. Because if they were talking about that in meetings in February of '62, this could be how we learned about their future intentions. It could be where it was first discussed. Robert McNamara, SECDEF himself, has subsequently stated that in 1962, the United States had a 17-to-1 advantage over the Soviet Union in strategic nuclear weapons. And the Soviets were painfully aware of that fact by this time. So the diplomatic containment proposed by George Kennan following the end of World War II and signed onto by everybody in 1948 had become military containment because of NSC 68. So this massive stockpiling of nuclear weapons recommended by NSC 68 had created this 17-to-1 strategic advantage in nuclear weapons. And as the Soviets feared, the peril of one side possessing such dominance was that it would tempt that side to use it. So the four reasons, in short, that the Soviets deployed nuclear missiles to Cuba were to redress somewhat the marked Soviet strategic inferiority in long-range nuclear weapons, to defend their only communist client state in the Western Hemisphere against invasion. And of course, Mongoose and the stink bomb memo in April have proven that there was good reason to fear an invasion of Cuba. Everybody wanted to do one except Jack Kennedy. Everybody else in the national security state wanted to invade Cuba. So they wanted to defend their client state, and they correctly feared that the US powers that be wanted to invade Cuba. Everybody did except the president. It would have permitted them to apply leverage against Berlin once the missiles in Cuba were operational, and the fait accompli was publicly announced in late November. So that was the plan, was for Khrushchev and Castro to publicly, jointly announce that these bases were operational in Cuba, these missile sites, to the world in late November. And it might have taken a little bit longer. It might have taken until December for the IRBMs to become operational, but in that case, they would have delayed the announcement until December. But they were going to announce this publicly and then use it as leverage against Berlin. And then Khrushchev colorfully said in one of the meetings in May that he wanted to put a hedgehog in Uncle Sam's pants. Khrushchev was a peasant at heart and was fond of crude statements and metaphors. And this was how he wanted to express it, how he did express it. I think the primary reason is the first one, to redress somewhat the marked Soviet strategic inferiority in long-range nuclear weapons, to make us think twice about launching a first strike, to make us not dare to launch a first strike against Russia, because if we did, we would be severely hurt by the missiles in Cuba. I think the secondary reason was probably to defend Cuba, a very close second in Khrushchev's mind. Now, the high-level Soviet meetings with Khrushchev, where he first asked for people to approve this, were held May 21st and May 24th, 1962. The only person of note opposing this was Anastas Mikoyan, high-level Soviet official in the Soviet government and this Communist Party, and everybody else signed on to it, including the defense minister, Malinovsky. The Soviets sent a military delegation and the new ambassador to Cuba, a KGB officer, to Cuba immediately after these two meetings in May. They did a survey in the country of where the missiles might go, and they talked Castro into it. So they came back and reported, and on June 10th, 1962, Khrushchev got the final and written approvals that he wanted. He had to twist a few arms, but he got the written approvals he wanted to do this thing. Now, I've got a busy slide here with the essential Cuban Missile Crisis events. Many of you are probably already well read on the missile crisis. Those of you who are will glance through this briefly and note the major milestones. Those of you who are not well read will want to come back later and revisit this slide and I think read all of it. But the major milestones are Kennedy's shown the photos on October 16th. On October 22nd, he makes a national speech announcing that he's going to do a blockade. A blockade's an act of war, so he called it a quarantine. He's going to do a quarantine, and he's not going to bomb and invade, at least not yet. On that day, he put the entire US military at Defense Condition 3. That's called DEFCON 3. Normal peacetime defense condition is DEFCON 5. He put the military at DEFCON 3, concurrent with his speech, Monday night, October 22nd. On the 23rd, Dean Rusk, under severe marching orders from Kennedy, got unanimous OAS approval, Organization of American States approval, for the US blockade. Only Uruguay abstained, and Cuba was a no-show. So that justified what we were about to do and call a quarantine. On October 24th, 1962, at 10 a.m., the quarantine went into effect. Later, JFK actually contracted the blockade line. He made it smaller, because some Soviet ships stopped right away and turned around, and some didn't. He wanted to do all he could to avoid a confrontation at sea, so he contracted the blockade line and gave the Soviets more time to think about it and realized that he's not trying to escalate. He's just trying to say no more. He's trying to say, stop, pull back, don't bring any more missiles in. And I think they understood that. Now, unfortunately, on the same day, at the same time of day, at 10 a.m., General Tommy Power, the commander of the Strategic Air Command, LeMay's handpicked replacement at SAC in 1957, he increased the DEFCON condition of the Strategic Air Command itself from DEFCON 3 to DEFCON 2 without presidential permission. He made two announcements in the clear. One was an unencrypted telegram, which we always sent unencrypted in those days. We wanted the rest of the world to know when we were doing this. But what he also did was make a voice transmission over the radio to all of his major Air Force commands within SAC. This had never been done before. And both of these were picked up by the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. That was his intent, to signal an escalation and scare the hell out of the Soviets, that we were serious, just as they had tried to scare the hell out of the world with their Tsar Bomba in November, on October 30th, 61. They scared the hell out of the world. Well, we scared the hell out of them by going to DEFCON 2 within SAC. This sent an escalatory signal to the USSR without JFK's permission, and JFK was furious. And his fury is depicted in the movie 13 Days. And some academics have written about this inaccurately, okay? And they've said, well, they've either lied and said, President Kennedy put all of the military at DEFCON 2. Well, I'm telling you, that's not true. It was Tommy Power, not JFK, who put only SAC at DEFCON 2. Kennedy didn't do it. Kennedy was furious. It could have started World War III, and Power and LeMay may have wanted it to. After the fact, LeMay supported Power's actions. Okay, Black Saturday was October 27th. It was given that name for a number of reasons. That's the day that we estimated all 36 MRBMs were operational. Actually, I think they'd all been operational, the final ones, 2 days before that, on the 25th. But we estimated that was the day they all went operational. That was also the day that one of the Soviet SA-2 anti-aircraft missile batteries shot down a U-2 spy plane, killed the pilot. This was perceived incorrectly by the whole US command structure below President Kennedy as an intentional escalation. It turned out the local Soviet troops were a little bit trigger happy, and they gave the subordinate commander, not the number one commander on Cuba, subordinate commander gave permission to shoot under time pressure. They had to make up their minds within 1 or 2 minutes to do it or not do it. And so the local Soviet troops shot it down, but without the permission of the number one commander in Cuba. And so the Joint Chiefs had wanted immediate retaliation, massive airstrikes in response against all the SAM sites. Kennedy decided not to. That's also the day that one of our U-2s, sampling the air over the North Pole for nuclear fallout to see if the Soviets were doing nuclear tests in the atmosphere, he got lost his way and ended up over Siberia, intercepted by Soviet fighters over Siberia. So that was a scary thing that happened. They could have interpreted that as a provocation or some kind of prelude to an attack, which it wasn't. It was a mistake as well. Also, unknown to us that day, I haven't talked about this yet, there were 92 Soviet tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba. I'm not talking about strategic weapons that could hit cities in the United States and Air Force bases. I'm talking about short-range, local use, tactical nuclear weapons. There were 92 of these in Cuba. We didn't know that. We had discovered the launchers, the mobile launchers like tractors for the so-called, what we called frog missiles. The Soviets called those Lunas. We discovered the tractors for those on Thursday, October 25th. Kennedy was briefed on Friday, October 26th. We got frog missile launchers. We don't know if there are nuclear warheads or not. It's a nuclear capable missile. We don't really know what this means. But they had, and there were 12 of those Lunas, and they had a short range of somewhere between 18 and 25 miles, depending on which book you reference. We didn't know anything about the 80 FKRs. There were 80 cruise missiles called FKRs. FKR means frontline missile in the Russian. 80 of those, like small unmanned MiG jets, carrying a bigger nuclear warhead than the Lunas. And 3 of those were lined up Saturday night, aimed at Guantanamo Bay Naval Base, armed with nuclear warheads, ready to fire and destroy Guantanamo Bay Naval Base if there was an invasion. We knew nothing about them being deployed. That's very frightening in retrospect. Michael Dobbs writes about that in his book, 1 Minute to Midnight. So Khrushchev, after an exchange of letters, and after Bobby Kennedy met with the Soviet ambassador Saturday night, and they both threatened each other with war, but Bobby Kennedy made the bigger threats, I think, and told him time was very short. Khrushchev capitulated over the public radio on Sunday to make sure that his message would be received before the U.S. had a chance to launch airstrikes in an invasion. And indeed, at the time, I think as Saturday ended, the plans by XCOM, the ad hoc committee that met every day to discuss the crisis, was to launch airstrikes either Monday or Tuesday. There was some vacillation between Monday and Tuesday, but that Tuesday at the latest, we would commence airstrikes and then we would invade 7 or 8 days later. So time was short, and he capitulated on the radio. Now, I just want to say one thing here. Even after the Russians agreed to remove the medium-range missiles from Cuba and the nuclear warheads for them, they planned initially to leave the 92 tactical nukes in Cuba under the control of Castro, whose forces would be trained to operate them. And he would have become a nuclear power. Not one that could strike another country, but a nuclear power that could defend his own country with defensive nuclear weapons if he was invaded. And then the KGB discovered, he sent a secret communication to his UN ambassador, Carlos Lechuga, in November, and he wanted Lechuga to announce this at the United Nations, that he was now a nuclear power. And the Soviets said, oh, no. We're just winding down this missile crisis. We've been negotiating with the Americans all month during most of November. Oh, no, we don't want you to do this. So they, at the suggestion of Anastas Mikoyan, the man who had originally objected to the whole scheme, he was Castro's handler, he delivered some more bad news to Castro. We're going to take the tactical nukes out of Cuba too. So that created a lot of unhappiness. We never knew they were there. We knew there were launchers for the 12 Frogs, but we never knew the 80 FKRs were there. And we never knew they were there, and we never knew they were removed in December. Pretty scary stuff. Now here's President Kennedy consulting with Secretary of Defense McNamara and JCS Chairman Taylor. They were both members of the XCOM, the executive committee of the NSC. And this committee met at least once, usually twice a day throughout the missile crisis and throughout most of the month of November. And here's a photo of one of their many meetings in the cabinet room. Here's another photo of the XCOM members very seriously at work. Many hours a day, they would meet together and discuss options. What are the Soviets up to? What is their attitude today? Are they softening? Are they hardening? What are we going to do? Are we going to bomb? Are we going to invade? So Kennedy met once during the crisis alone with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He wasn't totally alone. Bob McNamara was there, but McNamara, the Kennedy tapes revealed, didn't have anything to say. He was there, present with the military. I mean, that's the signal that we have civilian control in this country. He told them to appear. He appeared with them, but he didn't open his mouth. And they were there, and it was their chance to give direct, unfiltered advice to President Kennedy. So there are 2 books which publish different versions of those tape recordings. The first one is the Kennedy tapes, published by Ernest May and Philip Zelikow. And then later, a more extensive version of the recordings was published called the Presidential Recordings, edited by Timothy Naftali and Philip Zelikow, published by the Miller Center in Virginia. These transcripts are more complete and more accurate than the ones in the Kennedy tapes. So I've used the presidential recordings. All of these conversations are verbatim from this book. So on the first slide here, Taylor says, well, first, I believe we should attack with the benefit of surprise. So even Max Taylor, the urbane, sophisticated man who could quote Thucydides, who was Kennedy's favorite general, who was good friends with Robert Kennedy. He cultivated Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy named one of his children after Maxwell Taylor, named him Maxwell. Even he wanted to attack with massive airstrikes and later with an invasion. But Kennedy responds by doing a typical Kennedy thing, taking a longer view. Well, first, I think we ought to think of why the Russians did this. If we attack Cuba, the missiles or Cuba, in any way, then it gives them a clear line to take Berlin, as they were able to do in Hungary in '56 during the Suez Crisis. We would be regarded as the trigger-happy Americans who lost Berlin. We would have no support among our allies, Kennedy said. Taylor responds by saying, if we don't respond here in Cuba, we think the credibility of our response in Berlin is endangered. Well, this is a pretty direct conversation, open disagreement. It gets a lot worse. General LeMay crossed the line during this conversation and became grossly insubordinate. So let's go to slide 2. LeMay. I'd emphasize a little strongly, perhaps, that we don't have any choice but direct military action. If we do this blockade that's proposed in political action, the first thing that's going to happen is that your missiles are going to disappear into the woods. Now, we can't find them then, regardless of what we do. Now, as for the Berlin situation, I don't share your view that if we knock off Cuba, that they're going to knock off Berlin. We've got the Berlin problem staring us in the face anyway. If we don't do anything in Cuba, then they're going to push on Berlin and push real hard because they've got us on the run. JFK. What do you think their reprisal would be? LeMay. I don't think they're going to make any reprisal if we tell them that their Berlin situation is just like it's always been. If they make a move, we're going to fight. So I see no other solution. This blockade and political action I see leading into war. I don't see any other solution for it. It will lead right into war. This is almost as bad as the appeasement at Munich. Because if this blockade comes along, we're going to gradually drift into a war under conditions that are a great disadvantage to us. I just don't see any other solution except direct military intervention right now. Of course, when LeMay brought up Munich, he's not only comparing Kennedy to the pacifist prime minister of Great Britain in 1938, Neville Chamberlain, a man who cowardly, him and the French prime minister gave away part of Czechoslovakia to try to appease Hitler. And that didn't work. Hitler even became more hungry for more territory. But he's insulting Kennedy's father because Kennedy's father, Joseph B. Kennedy, at that time was ambassador to Great Britain. And he had been a great supporter of the Munich Pact afterwards, after it was consummated. So he's insulting Kennedy by comparing him to Neville Chamberlain, a weakling. And he's insulting Kennedy by comparing him to his father, who was later fired by Roosevelt. Now on slide 3, which I won't read, I'll let you read it. The Chief of Naval Operations, Anderson, the new Army Chief of Staff, General Wheeler, and the Marine Corps Commandant, Shoup, all agreed that the chief should take military action against Cuba. They should bomb and invade. And the one that was the most direct about it was Wheeler. Wheeler says, the lowest risk course of action, if we're thinking of projecting protecting the people of the United States against a possible strike on us is to go ahead with a surprise airstrike, the blockade, and an invasion. So that's the position of these three men. Now, this is the most important slide in the series. It's worth reading verbatim. LeMay. And you have made some pretty strong statements that we would take action against offensive weapons. I think that a blockade and political talk would be considered by a lot of our friends and neutrals as being a pretty weak response to this. And I'm sure a lot of our own citizens would feel that way too. In other words, you're in a pretty bad fix at the present time. An astonished JFK says, "What did you say?" LeMay, "You're in a pretty bad fix." JFK, "You're in there with me, personally." LeMay, "I think we have got to do more than take out the missiles, because if you don't take out their air at the same time, you're vulnerable." Then JFK goes back to his common theme. The big picture is his theme. You know, as I say, the problem is not really some war against Cuba. The problem is part of this worldwide struggle we face, where we face the communists, particularly, as I say, over Berlin. LeMay, "If you lose in Cuba, you're going to get more and more pressure right on Berlin. I'm sure of that." So then this conversation concludes with Taylor saying, well, we can't talk about invading again after those missiles become operational. Now, he's saying this on the 19th, and we were estimating they'd be operational by the end of the following week. So that's his mindset, because they'll have these pointed at our head. Of course, he didn't have that attitude a week later. A week later, he wanted to bomb and invade, even though we figured all the missiles were operational by then. But he still wanted to bomb and invade. But he's saying on the 19th that, well, we can't talk about invading again once these are operational. So he's trying to get Kennedy to commit to a rolling series of actions. And he says, 7 days after the airstrike, you could start the invasion. Kennedy says, well, we'd still have 7 days to decide whether we want to go in. Taylor confirms it by saying, we have flexibility. He clearly wants JFK to pull the trigger and order airstrikes. And he figures later he'll be forced to do the invasion. Wheeler, Mr. President, going back to the relationships between Cuba and Berlin, there is no acceptable military solution to the Berlin problem, whereas there is in Cuba. Kennedy says, well, I appreciate your views. The argument for the blockade was that what we wanted to do is avoid, if we can, nuclear war by escalation or imbalance. Now, this slide continues with some disrespect expressed for Kennedy by the Marine Corps Commandant, who is not the brightest bulb. Okay, Dino Brucione has written about General Shoup. He was a disappointment, his performance on Joint Chiefs as Commandant of the Marine Corps. And he'd been very brave in 1943 during the invasion of Tarawa, but he wasn't the best Commandant of the Marine Corps. So he would manage to see all sides of all issues and didn't ever seem too well prepared to give advice. But anyway, in this conversation, after Kennedy, Taylor, and McNamara leave the room, he says, well, to LeMay, he says, you pulled the rug right out from under him. I agree with you 100%. I agree with you 300%. He finally got around to the word escalation. I heard him say escalation. It's been there in Laos. It's been there in every goddamn one of these crises. When he says escalation, that's it. If somebody could keep him from doing the thing piecemeal, that's our problem. Shoup goes on, you're screwed, screwed, screwed. You can't fiddle around with taking out missiles. You got to do the whole thing. So this is what happens when the boss men leave the room. The other guys keep talking. Later, after the tensest part of the crisis is over, LeMay met with Kennedy on October 30th. Introduced him to 3 of the Air Force U-2 pilots. This is a great public domain photo from the Kennedy Library. It's where most of these photos are from. Now, as I say, JFK addressed the nation on October 22nd and signed the quarantine order on October 23rd. These are two more great public domain photos from the Kennedy Library. So a sober JFK addressed the nation after quarreling with key members of Congress. He met with them right before his 7 p.m. TV address. They thought him weak and indecisive. They thought his response of a blockade and not immediate airstrikes and invasion was weak. They thought he wasn't doing his duty, and he really got upset with them and essentially walked out of that meeting. And then the very next night, I say a resolute JFK signed the quarantine order 24 hours later at the famous Resolute desk. So here's a picture of him the next night signing the quarantine order. And here he is during the address on the 22nd. I think he met a good balance between coolness under fire and pushing back while not appearing to be weak. Some of the people in Europe, like the Brits, thought he was being a little bit alarmist and a little bit too threatening by saying that if any of these missiles are launched in the Western Hemisphere, we'll consider it an attack on the US by the USSR with a full retaliatory strike on the USSR. But that was just his attempt to say, you cannot use these weapons. I'm determined that you get them out and that you get them out through negotiations, and we'll talk about that, about how we do that, but you cannot use these weapons. So he said, I'll launch a strike on the USSR if you launch any of these missiles. But the rest of the speech was all reason and let's talk about it and justifying our position and justifying the quarantine, which was a midway step. It was not airstrikes. It was not an invasion. And then we had two behind the scenes photos of JFK on the left facing all of those movie cameras and TV cameras during the speech on the 22nd. And then him, look at all those cameras in his face while he's signing the quarantine order. It's rather intimidating, at least to me it looks that way. Now this is one of my favorite slides. I call it the imbalance of terror, showing how much more we were able to hurt the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons than they were able to hurt us with nuclear weapons. So we had, look, 142 operational Atlas missiles. These are intercontinental ballistic missiles. They could go over the North Pole, hit the USSR. 62 Titan missiles. Their ICBMs, even now, consisted of 6 ancient, obsolescent. Really, it took almost like 18 hours to get ready to launch R-7s, the same kind of rocket that had launched Yuri Gagarin into space. But they were very time-consuming to prepare for launch. They didn't have very many of them. And 20 of these new R-16s, but they weren't fully reliable yet. So we had 45 total intermediate range ballistic missiles with nuke warheads in Italy and Turkey. Now, as it turns out, in Turkey, they were being turned over to the Turks, and only one of the 15 became operational during the crisis, but the Russians didn't know that. All they knew is there were 15 Jupiter missiles in Turkey. There were 30 in Italy. And the man who had negotiated to get them in there was Lyman Lemnitzer. He was a big fan of nuclear weapons. So you can see that USSR in Cuba had 36 R-12s that could hit the United States. And then submarine-launched ballistic missiles called SLBMs. At the time, we had 2 Polaris missile-firing submarines at sea with 32 IRBMs on board that could hit the Soviet Union from either the North Sea or from the Med, the Western Med. They had none of their submarines at sea at this time. And their subs couldn't carry many missiles. One version, only 3 or 4 of them, and then they had to surface to fire them. And all those subs are out of commission at this time due to nuclear reactor leaks. And then look at the bombers. That's what I want you to really look at. The Soviets had about 100 long-range bombers. They had no in-flight fueling capability. So their bombers would have had to launch from bases inside Russia, land in the Arctic, in Arctic bases, and refuel before traveling over the North Pole to the United States. Otherwise, it was going to be a one-way trip and they'd never make it home. A suicide mission. We would have nuked their refueling sites in the event of a nuclear war. These 100 bombers wouldn't have even had a chance to refuel. And if they had been if some of the pilots had decided to go ahead and do the one-way flight, drop their bombs and then die when they run out of fuel or bail out and get captured, they probably all would have been shot down over Canada because we had a multi-layered defense. We had something like over 40 interceptor squadrons in the United States and Canada, 42 squadrons set to intercept Soviet bombers, and many of those airplanes had nuclear air-to-air missiles. I'm sure the few planes that got launched and made it over the North Pole would have been destroyed by air defenses. Look at us. 639 B-52 long-range bombers. The B-47 was a so-called medium-range bomber, but it had long-range capability because of in-flight refueling, and 880 of those were operational at this time, and 76 of the supersonic Mach 2 B-58s were operational. That's a tremendous imbalance, and we had a tanker fleet of about 1,000 tankers, different types of tankers. Most of them were KC-135s, jet tankers, and others were still propeller-driven, but we had a lot of airborne tankers. And then we had aircraft in the Western Mediterranean, in the Eastern Mediterranean and in the Western Pacific that could have dropped nuclear warheads on just inside Siberia, or in the case of the ones in the Med, just inside Southwest Soviet Union. And the Soviets had only 6. They had put 56 IL-28 bombers in Cuba, but they only had 6 nuclear bombs for them to carry. 6 of those planes were equipped to carry those 6 bombs. So this is an incredible imbalance. So here's some pictures of the quarantine, public domain pictures. The quarantine lasted from October 24th, actually through November 20th, because it was expected to also monitor the removal of the 36 medium-range ballistic missiles. So this went on for a long time. Another public domain photograph of the aerial surveillance of one of the Soviet ships. A lot of the Soviet ships had been purchased from foreign shipbuilders, and others were Soviet charters of Soviet-run ships. Now this is the Poltava, loaded with 7 of the 24 larger intermediate-range ballistic missiles, which had turned tail and headed for home the day after Kennedy's speech. So what the analyst has circled here on the photograph is the launch rings. You can't see it here, but the launch rings used for the base of the IRBMs as they sat on their permanent concrete launching pad, they had to sit on a launch ring. This is proof that there was IRBM equipment on the ship. Turned out there were 7 of those missiles on this one ship. The rest of the IRBMs were on other ships, and they all turned around and went home rather than be stopped or captured by the United States during the blockade. Now, all 24 nuclear warheads for these IRBMs made it to Cuba, but without missiles to launch them, they were useless and ended up just being liabilities. In fact, all 24 warheads for these IRBMs were kept in the hold of the ship that delivered them, the Alexandrovsk, which changed course and went to the port of La Isabela the day after Kennedy's speech. Go to the nearest port, they were told. So they went to the nearest port because the Soviets didn't want the ship with nuclear warheads on it to be intercepted. They were very sensitive about their nukes, just as we were. So as it turns out, on the same day the missile crisis started, on October 16th, General Marshal Pat Carter, the Deputy Director for Central Intelligence, the #2 guy in the CIA, had recommended to the Special Group Augmented of the NSC that Alpha 66 launch a commando raid and sink a Soviet ship in that port. Think about the implications of that. This is 2 days after the photos were taken of the missiles in Cuba. A full day after they were developed and analyzed, which was on the 15th. Some of them were developed and analyzed late on the 14th. The rest were developed and analyzed the 15th. He knew these things already. Here he is on the 16th recommending that we launch a commando raid and try to sink a Soviet ship in La Isabela, because Alpha 66 has already attacked the Soviet ship in that port previously. The implications of this are really scary when you think about it. Well, during the blockade, Secretary of Defense McNamara clashed seriously and repeatedly with Chief of Naval Operations George Anderson. Anderson had replaced Burke on October 1st, 1961. His nickname was Gorgeous George. And he was so highly thought of that people thought he would probably be the next chairman of the Joint Chiefs after Maxwell Taylor. So they clashed repeatedly over the Navy rules of engagement during the crisis. There were differing accounts of that from differing audiences, and some people tend to side with McNamara's viewpoints. Some people tend to side with Anderson. You can read different accounts in different books of how they clashed, but it's over rules of engagement. Kennedy allowed McNamara to get rid of Anderson the next year. He was forced into early retirement by McNamara, and his consolation prize was being appointed ambassador to Portugal by JFK. Folks, that's not much of a consolation prize. So there was only one time during the blockade that we actually stopped a ship at the blockade line, and we made sure that we chose a ship which we believed had harmless cargo. It was Panamanian owned, under Turkish registry, run by a Turkish crew, chartered by the Soviets. And we were right, there was no prohibited cargo on board, but we stopped one ship to prove that the blockade had some teeth. So that ship was stopped on Friday, October 26th, the day before Black Saturday, and it was stopped by the ship Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., the Navy destroyer named after President Kennedy's brother, who was killed in World War II. Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. was the one that the father wanted to be president. He was supposed to become the politician. He was the older, handsomer, more confident, more robust brother, actually somewhat of a bully, but he had been killed in a secret raid by a bomber that just blew up. He was trying to guide with radio control another bomber filled with explosives into a target. And his plane blew up and he was killed. So this is the ship named after Kennedy's brother. And so they discovered toilet paper on the ship and machine parts, and they opened one of the crates for the machine parts, and it was for agricultural equipment. So this turned out to be a big bust, but it allowed the United States to demonstrate that the blockade had at least some teeth. Now, this is a busy slide, a very important one about Tommy Power placing SAC on DEFCON 2. I want to draw your attention to the green in the middle of the slide. Before Kennedy made his speech, Monday, October 22nd, the U.S. was at normal peacetime defense condition, DEFCON 5. So that morning, they were at DEFCON 5. Under DEFCON 5, there were 12 B-52 bombers at all times circling right outside the borders of the Soviet Union, loaded with nuclear weapons, ready to go in and start a war if they were ordered to. That was supposed to be the deterrent against the Soviets ever starting a war, was that they knew our B-52s were always right outside their border. But it was only 12 of them. And that was called Operation Chrome Dome. And that operation was announced publicly by Tommy Power in 1961, but those airborne alerts have been going on the last couple of years of the 50s. And after 3,000 flights, SAC finally decided to announce that they existed. So there were normally 12 B-52s near the Soviet border. When JFK made the speech on Monday, October 22nd, and placed all of the military at DEFCON 3, an additional 54 bombers joined the 12 already in the air. So the number of airborne alert B-52s went up to 66 at all times on Monday the 22nd. And many more on the ground were on alert. Then on Wednesday, in red here, on October 24th, when Tommy Power went on the radio and said, "This is General Power," to all of SAC, and sent out his unencrypted telegram to back it up. And SAC went to DEFCON 2. ABC News claimed in 1992, in a documentary called The Missiles of October, they claimed that the number of nuclear-capable bombers on alert shifted to 1,500 overall, with 200 now on continuous airborne alert. Now, maybe ABC was rounding off these numbers, I don't know, but 200 is a lot more than 66. That's a significant portion of the B-52 bomber force, and surely some of the B-47s as well. And 145 ICBMs were on high alert, according to ABC News. Now, very similar numbers were published by Dino Brugioni in his book, Eyeball to Eyeball, and by Michael Dobbs in his book, 1 Minute to Midnight. Very similar numbers. So Richard Rhodes, in his book, Dark Sun, says that according to a retired SAC wing commander, at the height of the missile crisis, some airborne alert bombers deliberately flew past their normal turnaround points near the Soviet Union's border and continued flying towards Soviet airspace until Soviet freighters carrying crucial equipment to Cuba stopped dead in the Atlantic. That is a frightening story. No pilot would do that on his own. He would do that in response to orders. So it sounds like Tommy Power was freewheeling in that regard too. And some ships did go dead in the water, as determined by the NSA. Some ships didn't stop until later, but I believe the ships that stopped dead in the water were ships carrying sensitive equipment. And one retired general told Richard Rhodes, when he wrote the book Dark Sun, that I knew what my target was, he said, Leningrad. So this is General Tommy Power, the man handpicked by LeMay to be the next commander of SAC after he left in 1957, looking like a very happy fellow. During the mid-1950s, when LeMay and Power were both at SAC, they apparently tried to provoke the USSR into a fatal response with belligerent and provocative overflights of Soviet territory. Richard Rhodes writes about this in the book Dark Sun, and I recommend that book to everyone. It's pretty chilling to read about all this. Many were shot down. Some barely escaped with their lives, and some ended up prisoners for years. And on at least one occasion, and the quote in the book is attributed by name to the person that Power and LeMay said it to, they would say to their RB-47 pilots, reconnaissance pilots, told to go in and probe the Soviet defenses, fly deep into their country. Quote, if we run this mission properly, maybe we could start World War III, end quote. This was the attitude that LeMay and Power had in the 1950s when they knew that we had overwhelming superiority in numbers of nuclear weapons and also in delivery systems. So this may have been what Power was hoping for when he put SAC at DEFCON 2. And remember, LeMay later defended that action to President Kennedy, although common sense would have told both of these men that that's a signal of intentional escalation, which Kennedy did not want to send. They understood why he was upset. They just didn't care. So there was considerable fog of war during the missile crisis. I've got 2 slides on this. I think this is absolutely fascinating. And this is what Kennedy was always afraid of as president, was that nuclear war could begin through mistake or miscalculation. So here's the actual Soviet nuclear order of battle, what we know about it today. 36 R-12 MRBMs were in Cuba. They had 24 launchers. We were never quite sure of the total number because they also had training missiles that looked the same from the air. So they had the real missiles and then dummies for training. And so we actually thought there were more than this, but we weren't sure. And by the time we started talking to the Russians in November, we thought there were actually 33. And they said, no, there were 36. And then we said, oh. Now, each R-12 had a 1 megaton nuclear warhead. Those were not taken to close to the launch sites of the MRBMs until the 25th or the 26th of October. But they were all in Cuba, and there was a central nuke storage site called Bejucal, which we knew nothing about. We thought the nukes were stored in other places where they had been offloaded from ships. No, there was a central site. We didn't know it was the central site called Bejucal, and that's where these things were. And then the commander there in Cuba moved the nuclear warheads for the R-12 missiles close to their launch sites the evening of the 25th or 26th, before Black Saturday. By the way, I just found this out, one of the three missile regiments, there were going to be 5 missile regiments in Cuba, 2 for the IRBMs and 3 missile regiments for the MRBMs. One of the 3 missile regiments actually went operational on October 20th, before Kennedy's speech. I didn't know that till recently. The other 2 R-12 missile regiments went operational about the 25th. And then if you could consider it the 26th, you say, well, the nuclear warheads weren't moved close to them until the 26th. But those are things we didn't know. So as I say here, the 24 R-14 IRBMs turned around at sea, were never offloaded, but all 24 of their 1 megaton warheads arrived in Cuba and were kept on board the ship Alexandrovsk, which turned out was recommended to be a target. Any ship in that port was going to be a target for a commando raid based on the Pat Carter recommendation on October 16th, which he made. You realize now he's an Army officer. It's the Army controlling Viciana, thanks to John Newman's clarifications, not the CIA. The Army's controlling Viciana. Ed Lansdale and his minions are controlling Viciana. And it's Pat Carter, an Army officer, even though he's deputy director of the CIA, it's an Army officer in touch with Lansdale who's suggesting that Alpha 66 attack another Soviet ship in La Isabela. It turns out that the ship with nuclear warheads ends up going to that port on October 23rd. So it's a very scary scenario that's unfolding here. And if Alpha 66 had attacked and sunk that ship, it could have been a casus belli for the Soviets. If they hadn't been so scared to death of our nuclear weapons, it could have been a cause for war. They could have viewed that as an act of war by the United States if we had attacked and sunk that ship with the nuclear warheads in it. But fortunately, it didn't happen. So anyway, the Soviets, unknown to us, had 6 atomic bombs, 12 kilotons each. The Hiroshima bomb was 15 kilotons. And the Nagasaki bomb was about 20 kilotons. So these were just a little smaller than that, 12 kiloton atomic bombs. So there were 12 of those in Cuba, intended for use with 6 of the IL-28 bombers. Totally unknown to the United States, unknown as a fact, is that the Soviets had 12 Luna missiles, which we called frogs. We discovered the transporter for one of the Lunas, which implies certainly that they're there, but we didn't know if they had nuclear warheads or not. There were 12 of these. They were solid fuel rockets, a range of 18 to 25 miles, intended for use against invasion troops. there were 80 of these larger, longer range FKR pilotless cruise missiles, which would be launched with a rocket charge, and then a little jet engine would take over, and the cruise missile would fly on the jet engine until the people controlling it, would cut off the engine and tell it to drop on the target. So they were controlled by telemetry, by the people who launched them. And there were 80 of these, and as I said, 3 of them were lined up on Guantanamo Bay on the night of Black Saturday. They had 14 kiloton nuclear warheads. That's about the size of the Hiroshima bomb. 3 of them aimed at Guantanamo, and we didn't know that. Now, the CIA never definitely ascertained there were any nuclear warheads in Cuba. They ended up assuming there were for the sake of prudence. Well, of course there were. Why else would the Soviets put MRBMs in Cuba unless they were going to launch nuclear warheads? But, although the CIA discovered with photographs the construction of nuclear warhead bunkers near the MRBM launch sites, they never had any evidence that there were nuclear warheads in those bunkers. Well, they weren't in the bunkers. They were in transfer vans, in trucks. This is what we figured out after the missile crisis. The nuke warheads were in transfer vans and driven around freely in these trucks, and we didn't even know about that. We weren't targeting the trucks. So we never knew there were 92 tactical nukes in Cuba that could have slaughtered any US invasion force, even if only used in part. And we underestimated the range of the MRBMs and the IRBMs by about 20%. For example, the charts prepared for Kennedy to look at of the medium-range missiles said they could barely reach Washington, D.C. and the Southeast United States. So there were a lot of SAC bases in the Southeast, several major cities. And of course, nobody in Washington wants Washington to be destroyed since they live there. It turned out the MRBMs could actually reach just beyond New York City. And they could reach just beyond Omaha, Nebraska, where SAC headquarters is. But we didn't know that. We had underestimated their range. And we had underestimated the range of the IRBMs, which, if offloaded, they could have reached anywhere in the United States and part of Canada. So this is an important paragraph here. The Soviet commander in Cuba was General Pliev. He's an old cavalry officer. He was given oral permission by Nikita Khrushchev himself in July of '62, before he left the USSR, to use the tactical nukes to repel a US invasion if there were no longer communications with Moscow. This is the tactical nukes I'm talking about, the 92 tactical nukes to repel an invasion if they couldn't communicate with Moscow. The tactical nukes weren't there yet, but that's not the point. They knew they were going to send them later. They couldn't send everything at once. They sent the most important cargo first, the big missiles and the support equipment. But he was given permission to use them, oral permission, if he was invaded. Later, the defense minister, who was Marshal Malinovsky, who supported the whole scheme, by the way, his staff prepared for him a military telegram telling Pliev that you have permission to use these in the event of an invasion and in the event Moscow can't talk to you. And then Malinovsky decided at the last minute, well, I'm not going to release that telegram. I'm not going to approve that it be sent. We don't want too much in writing. So the draft remained in the files, and it's now been released. And we know that the draft was written on September the 8th, but Malinovsky didn't send it. And yet he reconfirmed Khrushchev's oral directions in October. He sent out there to Cuba General Gribkov, who was a member of the general staff and who later became a member of the the commander of the Warsaw Pact forces. He was in Cuba during the crisis. He arrived October 18th. And he was told by Malinovsky, by Marshal Malinovsky, the defense minister, before he left, that I was present when Nikita Sergeyevich notified General Pliev of oral permission to use the tactical nukes. And that permission still stands, with conditions, but you have to be invaded by the US. But if you're invaded and you can't talk to us, you may use them. Now later, after Khrushchev got scared, when he found out on the 22nd that Kennedy was going to address the nation, it was like, oh my God. So on the 22nd, and again on the 27th, he sent cables, telegrams, to the Soviet commanders in Cuba saying, you do not have permission to fire any of the missiles or use any of the nuclear warheads. So the permission to use the tactical nukes was rescinded twice, on October 22nd and October 27th. But two Soviet generals, Generals Grebkov and Titov, who were both there, and who had assessed the morale of their troops, subsequently stated that it would have been a use or lose situation in the event of an invasion, and they both expressed the opinion that some of the tactical nukes would have been used anyway by Soviet troops in the event the US invaded Cuba. Because proud soldiers don't want to throw up their hands and surrender. These were professionals, just like our military men. It was the biggest adventure their military had ever embarked upon, the biggest logistical exercise, too. They wouldn't have just thrown up their hands. Some of these things would have been used. So I go on here, we greatly underestimated the numbers of Soviet troops in Cuba. At the time of October 27th and 28th, there were about 42,500 troops present, and we were still underestimating it. We had estimated that our estimates went up to about 20,000, but we were 20,000 short of the true number. We really underestimated the numbers of combat troops there. Of the 42,500 Soviet troops, there were 4 Soviet motorized rifle regiments. That's a total of about 10,000 combat troops, with about 124 tanks and sophisticated weapons, including artillery. And a Cuban army, there was a Cuban army of 75,000 men, and a Cuban militia of about 100,000 at this time. So the US invasion force on the day of the invasion would have been about 90,000 men. Although McNamara says we had 180,000 men, I think he's including the Navy sailors on all the ships. And so the actual numbers of troops, Marines and Army that would have landed on D-Day was about 90,000. I think the 90,000 would have encountered severe challenges, possibly leading to nuclear escalation by the United States. Now, if the Soviets had used any tactical nukes, even one, nuclear retaliation by American forces would have been a certainty. And it would have been widespread, I'm sure. LeMay had 6 B-47 bombers standing by on 15-minute alert during the whole crisis in the Southeast, ready to take flight and fry Cuba if needed. So, pretty scary stuff. Admiral Dennison, Sinkland, requested that U.S. tactical nukes named Honest John be added to the invasion force when he found out about the Lunas, found out about the frog. We called them frogs, after they were briefed to JFK on Friday the 26th. Secretary of Defense McNamara forbade their deployment on the invasion ships, but he did stage them in Florida. In case they were needed in Cuba, they were close by, ready to go in Florida. That's a sobering thought also. So President Kennedy clashed again with LeMay, not only with LeMay, but with the other chiefs as soon as the missile crisis was over. I've reconstructed this from reading 3 different books and from listening to a video interview of Robert McNamara. This is the conversation I've come up with. I'm confident that it's pretty darn accurate. And I don't know if this happened on October 28th or the next day, but it happened right about that time too. JFK. Gentlemen, we've won. I don't want you to ever say it, but you know we've won, and I know we've won. Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Anderson, blurted out, "We've been had." This is the man that argued with McNamara. General LeMay, "One, hell, we lost. We should go in and wipe them out today. This is the greatest defeat in our history. Mr. President, we should invade today." And apparently, President Kennedy was so shaken by this pushback that he was left stuttering and stammering during this face-to-face meeting. So here's my retrospective of what happened in '62. Kennedy's relationship with the senior military leadership and the senior hawks in government went from distrust to mutual contempt. The world is fortunate that John F. Kennedy was president in October of '62. His decision not to invade Cuba saved the world from nuclear conflagration. Such a total nuclear war would have resulted, we now know, in nuclear winter and would have destroyed world agriculture and civilization, not to mention hundreds of millions, or more likely billions of lives. We learned about nuclear winter when all the scientific papers were published in the early and mid-1980s and in through the '90s. We were going to nuke half the planet with our overwhelming arsenal, and all of the resulting fires from the nuclear fireballs would have created a pall of smoke and radioactive debris, but largely a pall of smoke around the world that would have blotted out the sun for 2 or 3 years. It would have destroyed all agriculture, destroyed the world food supply, and lowered the temperature on the earth to below freezing and over at least half of the earth all year long. So this would have been a disaster if we had done what LeMay and Power wanted to do. The US military leadership never forgave JFK for not bombing and invading Cuba. They remained bitter in the extreme. Remember, Curtis LeMay called it the greatest defeat in our history and said to JFK afterwards, "One hell, we lost." Their attitude toward him was the same at the end of '62 that it was at the end of '61. They thought he was too squeamish about the use of nuclear weapons. And they weren't. They viewed them as just a better form of strategic bombing, and they weren't afraid to use them. And many of them wanted to use them. People that wanted to use them were Arleigh Burke, Lyman Lemnitzer, Curtis LeMay, Tommy Power. I'll tell you 2 other people that wanted to use nuclear weapons during the missile crisis were Paul Nitze and Roswell Gilpatrick, civilian hawks. This is really scary stuff, folks. So from their point of view, if JFK had bailed out the Bay of Pigs in April of '61 and overthrown Castro with US military power in '61, there would have been no missiles in Cuba. That's their point of view. Remember, the Joint Chiefs insisted that Kennedy invade Cuba in March of '62 with Northwoods, and again in April with the stink bomb memo. And JFK refused each time. If he had done so, they surely reasoned, there would have been no missiles in Cuba. And then when he didn't invade, when he had justification, that's when I believe they decided he was a traitor. They decided he was weak and he was a traitor and he was not fit to serve. So I'm personally convinced that the military animus for John F. Kennedy was so great that the assassination plot against him was born immediately after the Cuban Missile Crisis in November and December of 1962. Mutual skepticism had morphed into mutual distrust during 1961. And in 1962, had become mutual contempt. Mutual contempt. I agree with John Newman that while critical elements of the CIA were surely willing handmaidens in JFK's assassination, the galactic center of the assassination plot came from the military, within the Pentagon, as it were. Not entirely within the Pentagon. Later, Lemnitzer went back to Europe. But the point is, when I say in the Pentagon, I mean within the military leadership structure. He first said this publicly in November of 2020 during another online conference, and he repeated this conclusion of his in his presentation on March 17th for the Future of Freedom Foundation. This concludes part 2 of my 3-part presentation.